Want to know what makes some people terrifyingly resilient? It isn't that life hurts them less. It's that pain doesn't get the final vote over what they do next. Even when everything feels completely uncertain, they still panic, overthink, cry, lose sleep, and sometimes wonder whether they've finally reached their breaking point. The difference is what happens after the emotional storm arrives, because they've learned something most people never deliberately practice. They know how to return to themselves before one terrible moment becomes a permanent identity. And psychology reveals something fascinating. Resilience isn't simply toughness. It's strongly connected to how your brain learns control. Your mind is constantly asking one quiet question during difficult moments. Can anything I do actually change this situation? When the answer repeatedly feels like no, motivation can shrink, avoidance becomes attractive, and simple tasks start feeling enormous. But when your actions repeatedly create small changes, your brain receives a completely different message about your ability to cope. That is where resilience begins, not with positive thinking, but with evidence that your choices can still matter. Think about your phone for a second. Whenever something feels uncomfortable, how quickly can you escape the feeling? Bored? Scroll. Lonely? Message someone. Anxious? Watch something. Awkward conversation? Tell yourself you'll deal with it tomorrow. Modern life offers thousands of tiny exits from discomfort, and your brain becomes extremely good at noticing those exits. The problem isn't comfort itself. The problem begins when escaping discomfort becomes your automatic response to almost everything. Because every escape teaches your brain something, even when you never consciously realize you're training a pattern. It learns that uncomfortable feelings are emergencies, and emergencies should be escaped before they become unbearable. Eventually, the feeling itself can become scarier than the situation that created it in the first place. That's when your world can quietly shrink, while you keep telling yourself you're simply protecting your peace. Now, sometimes protecting your peace is absolutely healthy, necessary, and wise, especially when something genuinely harms your well-being. The uncomfortable question is different. Are you protecting yourself, or avoiding something difficult that you could actually handle? Those two behaviors can look almost identical from the outside, but psychologically, they can lead you toward completely different futures. The difference becomes important when discomfort arrives, because one response expands your life while the other quietly shrinks it. One protects your well-being. The other can teach your brain that discomfort should always be escaped, even when you're capable. And avoidance is incredibly seductive because it gives you something immediately, relief sometimes within seconds. You skip the difficult conversation, your anxiety drops, and your brain quietly records that escape as a successful strategy. You postpone the application, fear disappears temporarily, and postponing suddenly feels much safer than discovering the actual answer. You avoid the gym, the project, the phone call, and once again relief arrives right on schedule. Your brain notices that relief, and behaviors followed by immediate relief can become surprisingly difficult to stop repeating. That's the trap. Avoidance rarely announces itself as fear. It often arrives disguised as peace, timing, or self-care. And slowly, your life can become smaller, not because you're incapable, but because fewer things feel worth risking discomfort. Resilience requires a different relationship with discomfort, one where difficult feelings can exist without automatically controlling your behavior. You don't need to become someone who loves difficult things because honestly almost nobody does. You simply need to become someone who doesn't automatically run whenever difficulty makes your nervous system uncomfortable. Sometimes courage is sending one email while your stomach is doing absolutely ridiculous things, and sending it anyway. Sometimes courage is opening the document you've avoided for 3 weeks because starting feels more frightening than failing. Sometimes courage is finally saying what needs to be said instead of rehearsing the conversation inside your head forever. These moments look insignificant, but psychologically they're much bigger because you're creating evidence about your own ability to act. You're teaching yourself that discomfort can sit beside you without getting to decide what you do next. And that lesson becomes especially important when life gives you something you genuinely cannot control. This connects to one of psychology's most fascinating findings. Repeated experiences of uncontrollability can influence future attempts to act. Early research on learned helplessness showed that repeated uncontrollable experiences can reduce attempts to escape when escape later becomes possible. Later research complicated that picture, highlighting the importance of perceived control, learning, and expectations about possible outcomes. The important word is uncontrollability, because difficulty alone isn't necessarily what makes people give up. The brain pays attention to what happens when effort meets difficulty, and whether action appears capable of changing anything. If effort repeatedly seems useless, trying can eventually feel pointless before you've even consciously decided to quit. But when effort sometimes produces change, your brain has a reason to keep engaging, experimenting, and trying again. That's why tiny wins matter more than people realize, especially when you're recovering from something that made you feel powerless. Not because making your bed magically fixes heartbreak, unemployment, grief, rejection, or failure overnight, because it obviously doesn't. It matters because action can reconnect you with something deeper. The experience of still influencing your own environment. That is psychologically more useful than telling yourself everything happens for a reason, especially when life feels brutally unfair. Sometimes things happen for terrible reasons, and pretending otherwise doesn't make you stronger or wiser. What matters is discovering what remains available to you after something goes wrong, even when the original situation cannot change. Maybe you can't change what happened, but you can still influence what happens next, even slightly. And that tiny distinction is where resilience stops being an inspirational word and becomes an actual psychological skill. Now here's another pattern that quietly destroys resilience, especially among people who think deeply about everything. It's the need for life to admit that you were treated unfairly before you allow yourself to move forward. You know the feeling. Someone hurts you and suddenly your brain becomes a detective who refuses to close the case. You replay their words, analyze their motives, imagine better responses, and reconstruct the entire relationship from every possible angle. At first, you're trying to understand what happened, but eventually you're trying to reach a verdict. And maybe the verdict is completely correct. Maybe they really were selfish, dishonest, cruel, or simply wrong. But here's the uncomfortable question. What are you getting from proving it again tomorrow and the day after that? Because there comes a point where understanding becomes rumination wearing glasses, looking intelligent while keeping you emotionally stuck. You're still staring at the same event, just from increasingly sophisticated angles, hoping one perfect explanation will finally release you. The person who hurt you may have moved on completely while you're still arguing with them inside your head. That's the hidden cost of the fairness trap. Your freedom becomes dependent on someone else's ability to understand. You wait for an apology, an explanation, regret, or acknowledgement that may never arrive, no matter how long you wait. And suddenly, the person who hurt you is still controlling your emotional timeline without even being present. Moving forward doesn't mean declaring what happened acceptable, forgiving instantly, or pretending their behavior didn't matter. It means refusing to give someone else's future realization unlimited control over your future. You can hold someone accountable without giving their future realization unlimited control over your future. Sometimes closure isn't another conversation. Sometimes closure is realizing you don't need another conversation to begin living differently. Then comes the third trap, and this one can quietly turn ordinary setbacks into full-blown identity crises. You fail an exam and suddenly you're stupid. Someone rejects you, and suddenly you're unwanted. A relationship ends, and suddenly you're impossible to love. A business fails, and suddenly you're bad at everything. Notice what happened. One event quietly transformed into a permanent description of who you believe you are. That's a terrible psychological bargain because events can change, while identities often feel permanent and impossible to negotiate. You can repair a failed project, improve a skill, learn from rejection, or rebuild after losing something important. But how exactly do you fix someone who believes they are fundamentally defective, unworthy, or doomed? The problem becomes so enormous that your brain doesn't know where to begin, so it often chooses avoidance. That's why changing the question matters more than repeating another motivational sentence about believing in yourself. Instead of asking, "What's wrong with me?" ask, "What happened? What did I learn? And what can I influence now?" That question turns a personal verdict back into a specific problem, and specific problems give you something extremely valuable. They give you a next move, even when the bigger picture still looks confusing and overwhelming. Resilient people aren't necessarily better at predicting the future. They're often better at returning attention to today's controllable choices. They don't need certainty before acting, because they've learned that action can happen alongside uncertainty. That is why the smallest controllable action matters so much after a major setback or emotional shock. Don't ask yourself to rebuild your entire life before breakfast, especially when you're already emotionally exhausted. Ask instead, what can move if I push it right now, even if the movement is ridiculously small? Send one message. Open one document. Take one shower. Walk outside. Make one appointment. Finish one tiny task. It may feel laughably small compared with everything you're dealing with, and that's completely okay. You're not solving everything today. You're rebuilding the connection between intention and action, one small decision at a time. You decide something and then you watch yourself actually do it, creating evidence that your choices still matter. Then you create another piece of evidence, and eventually those small experiences begin changing the story you tell yourself. Not everything will work out, because sometimes everything absolutely does not work out the way you wanted. A stronger belief is this: I can do something useful even when life doesn't give me the outcome I wanted. Now let's take this one step further, because resilience isn't only about reacting better after something goes wrong. You can deliberately practice manageable difficulty before life forces you to handle something enormous, unexpected, and genuinely overwhelming. Finish something difficult instead of abandoning it the moment your excitement disappears. Learn something you're currently bad at, and let yourself be uncomfortable without turning that discomfort into self-judgment. Exercise consistently, have the postponed conversation, or spend 20 minutes without your phone when boredom starts screaming. These aren't magical rituals, and suffering doesn't make anyone morally superior. They're simply opportunities to practice staying engaged when your brain would rather choose the easiest exit. Every time you do that, you're collecting evidence about what you're capable of handling when life gets uncomfortable. I can feel uncomfortable and still choose what happens next, even when my emotions strongly disagree. That is a much more useful form of confidence than believing nothing bad will ever happen again. But don't make another mistake. Resilience does not mean becoming emotionally untouchable or impossible to affect. Someone who never cries isn't automatically stronger than someone who cries and still takes the next necessary step. Someone who refuses help isn't automatically more independent, and someone who never changes plans isn't automatically stronger. Sometimes emotional armor looks impressive until reality demands flexibility, vulnerability, adaptation, or honest support. Real resilience includes knowing when to push, when to pause, when to ask for help, and when to change direction. You can be strong enough to say, "I need help," without turning that sentence into a confession of failure. You can be disciplined enough to rest without secretly believing you're falling behind everyone else. You can care deeply about someone without allowing their choices to control your entire emotional life. And you can be genuinely hurt without turning that hurt into a permanent identity. That's the kind of mind worth building, because it doesn't require becoming colder, harder, or less human. It allows you to remain sensitive without becoming completely controlled by every emotional wave. Think about the strongest person you know, and you may realize they aren't calm all the time. They simply seem to trust themselves more around difficult emotions because they've survived enough of them before. Experience doesn't guarantee an easy life, but it can create a powerful memory. I've handled hard things before. That memory becomes especially valuable during the next crisis, when your mind predicts that everything is about to collapse. You can answer that fear with evidence rather than empty reassurance. I've been scared before. I've been disappointed before. I've lost things before. And somehow I kept moving. That doesn't mean the next challenge will be easy, and it doesn't promise you'll handle everything perfectly every time. It means you've stopped demanding perfection before giving yourself permission to begin. Maybe that's the real secret behind resilient people. They don't require themselves to feel completely ready before taking action. They understand that readiness often arrives after movement, not before it. So when life knocks you down again, don't ask whether you're strong enough to never fall. Ask whether you can find one thing you can influence, one person you can trust, and one next step. Because resilience isn't a personality type reserved for people who had easier childhoods, stronger confidence, or fewer problems. It's something that can grow whenever you repeatedly experience yourself responding to difficulty instead of surrendering to it. And one day, you'll face something that once would have completely destroyed your sense of direction. It will still hurt, but you'll notice something different underneath the pain. You won't immediately believe the worst thing your mind tells you, because you've learned not every thought deserves authority. You won't need every answer before moving, because you've learned uncertainty isn't the same thing as helplessness. You won't need everyone to understand you, because you've learned their understanding isn't required for your life to continue. You won't need to become emotionless, because you've learned emotions can be felt without becoming instructions. And you won't need to prove you're unbreakable, because you've finally understood something much more useful. Being knocked down isn't the frightening part anymore. Staying down is the part you know how to change. Maybe that is what a truly strong mind looks like from the inside when nobody else is watching. Not fearless, not numb, not endlessly positive, just increasingly confident that difficult moments are temporary places. You've been there before, you found your way out before, and you can learn another way forward this time. So here's the question I want you to sit with tonight. Which trap has been controlling you lately? Avoiding discomfort because it feels safer, demanding fairness before moving forward, or turning one painful event into your identity? Be honest in the comments, because naming the pattern is often the first moment you stop letting it operate invisibly. And if someone came to your mind while watching this, send them this video, because people sometimes need understanding first. Remember this. You don't need to build a mind that never breaks. You need one that knows how to recover. Save this idea for a difficult day. You're allowed to hurt, pause, breathe, and still choose your next move. Your life does not need perfect conditions before you begin again. Sometimes beginning again is how the conditions slowly change. The goal was never becoming unbreakable. The goal was becoming someone who trusts themselves to find the way back. And that is resilience. Not becoming impossible to hurt, but becoming increasingly difficult to convince that you're finished.
Stop chasing motivation. Start understanding your mind. Subscribe to Inner Violet and learn how to think, not just react.